Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, "This person began to build and wasn't able to finish." Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able, with 10,000 men, to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples.
Hey, I appreciate you watching today. We're beginning a new series, Stories from Jesus. Starts today, May 31st. We'll continue through the month of June. 5 weeks, Stories from Jesus. We're going to take a deep dive into these stories, do a little connecting dots, some unpacking to see what did Jesus mean with his original listeners and what do his words mean to us today. And what we're going to find out is there's a correlation there regardless of times in history. Jesus' words haven't changed their meaning over time, but how do we interpret them in the light of the time in which we're now living? So Luke chapter 14, the text was already read for us. I want to start a few verses before the reading of the text up into verse 25 to lay a little bit of groundwork here. What we're told by Luke is that large crowds are following Jesus. He doesn't give us this precise location of where Jesus is at this particular point in his ministry, but he says he's attracted quite a crowd of people. And for some reason it says Jesus turns to them. As we read the following verses and we dig into this, we're going to find out the reason why Jesus turned to them. Evidently, what Jesus is addressing here is shallow admiration. Have you ever been there? You become a fan of an artist or an athlete, a musician or a politician, and you have this admiration for them, but it's shallow to a point until it begins to cost something. What Jesus is dealing with is people who are following him because of the miracles that he's done, because of all the gossip that has been traveling around about this teacher named Jesus. And so he's really addressing why they're following him in the first place and what they need to understand about following Jesus. That's why his words are relevant to us today, because we can fall into the same boat of becoming a fan of Jesus. Well, I really love the greatest commands. I really love the parable of the Good Samaritan. Oh, what about this other story that Jesus told? Oh, this is amazing. Jesus was all about love. We become a fan of Jesus, but when Jesus turns to us and calls us to do something that we may not want to do, or maybe that we don't agree with, that really challenges the depth of our commitment to following Jesus. That's what Jesus is doing here with this crowd. He is addressing their level of commitment. Do you really know what it means to follow me? He's doing the same thing with us as well. It's important because, look, what is it that keeps you a follower of Jesus? Is it when everything goes right in your life? Is it when every prayer that you ask is answered according to the way that you want it to be answered? Is it when you can eliminate all the worry and stress of your life? What is it that keeps you a follower of Jesus? None of those things will keep you a follower of Jesus because those things will ebb and flow. For example, emotion's a big thing that brings people to Jesus. Have you ever been at a major gathering of people? When I was growing up, we went to a lot of youth rallies, and sometimes there'd be a lot of emotion in that room, and you'd see someone respond to the preacher's invitation, then someone else would respond, and someone else would respond, and someone else would respond. I used to go to church camp when I was growing up, and we'd see the same thing there. There's a lot of emotion in that moment, and that doesn't deny the legitimacy of anyone's desire to give their life to Jesus. But that kind of emotion will not keep us connected to Jesus. And here's what I mean by this. Here's some statistics from the Pew Research Forum. Do you realize that 22% of people who grew up as Christians no longer practice the Christian faith, no longer believe in it? 22%. 35% of people leave, when they become adults, leave the faith of their youth. And that varies, that number, from various denominations. 91 million Americans have switched religions. So if we're just relying on emotions or everything to go in our favor, that's not going to keep us connected to Jesus. There has to be a deeper level of commitment. And that's what Jesus is talking about. What does it mean to be a disciple of His? So let's look at what Jesus says here. Verse 26, He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, even their own life, cannot be my disciple. That's pretty heavy on the surface. What exactly does Jesus mean here? We have to hate family? We have to hate our own life? That doesn't sound healthy at all. Well, consider the context of Jesus' teachings. He said elsewhere that we are to honor father and mother, that we're to care for our family. In fact, there's one occasion recorded in the Gospel of Mark when some people are neglecting the needs of their families so they can give that money to God. They're using God as an excuse not to address the needs in their family. And Jesus calls them out on it and says, no, that's not what God intended. That's not what God wants. So when we look at the totality of the teachings of Jesus, He's not telling us to hate our families in that way. The word hate here literally conveys the notion of love less than. For example, our media minister here at the church loves the Chicago Cubs. I don't know why. He's from Louisiana, but he loves the Cubs for some reason. If I asked him, Carl, do you love the Cubs as much as you love your wife, Donna? You know what he's going to say? No. This is what Jesus is getting at. There are things that He will do for His wife that He will not do for the Chicago Cubs baseball club. He just won't. Because that's a difference. There's a different level of love there. This is what Jesus is talking about here. He's not saying to purposely estrange yourself from your family, to be hateful and spiteful toward them. He's talking about loving God even more than your family. Because here's the deal, anything can come between you and God, including family. Now this may be a little tough. But God is telling us family comes second. Maybe you didn't grow up that way. Maybe you're always told nothing matters more than blood. Family is the most important thing. And we want to honor our families. We want to love our families. We want to care for our families and support them. But we do not want to put them in a position of God. We don't want to put them in a position where we love God as much as our family. Or where that love is the same, I should say. And here's why. Because unless we truly love God first, I'm not sure we can really completely love our families in the way that we should. That's why Jesus starts with the greatest commands. Love God. Love God. Because until we love God, we can't love our neighbor as ourselves. Until we love God first, we can't really love our families the way that we should. Jesus' point here is priorities. Where are your priorities in terms of your commitment? What do you love the most in your life? And whenever we get those priorities skewed, if we put anything above God, it hinders our ability to love anyone or anything else in the way that we should. Someone said years ago, we make provision for what is nearest and dearest to us. We go to great lengths to show our love for those who we consider to be near us and dear to us. The question is, does our walk with the Lord elicit that kind of devotion? Mark Moore, writing about this, makes the simple statement, to be a disciple of Jesus demands total allegiance. And that's not something we're typically comfortable with. We have allegiance up to a point, but total allegiance means everything. This is what Jesus is getting at. The second thing he says here, whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. What exactly does it mean to carry our cross? Sometimes we equate that with minor inconveniences. Like I was going to church today and I got a flat tire, or I ran out of gas, or I'm not sure that Jesus, not to negate those inconveniences, but I'm not sure that's what Jesus is getting at here in this particular text. To carry a cross is something that is painful. Putting God above family can be a painful ordeal. It can be, anytime we reorder our priorities that have been set already, that becomes painful because no change is pleasant at the time. Change is painful. When you talk about carrying the cross, one way we carry the cross is by putting family second. Another way to carry our cross is to make our plans submissive to the Lord. In the book of Acts, chapter 16, the Apostle Paul and some companions are traveling around and they're preaching about Jesus. Well, naturally, we would say that's a great thing. They should go everywhere and preach about Jesus. Except they want to go to a certain place, and Acts 16 verse 7 says the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to go. Now, we could argue the point and say, we're talking about Jesus. They should go everywhere. But for some reason, the Spirit of Jesus kept them from going where they wanted to go. Rather than to fight against that, they submitted themselves to God's will. And you know what happened? They go somewhere else. The Apostle Paul receives this vision of a man in another place calling for help, and he realizes this is where God is wanting us to go. So we take our plans, our great plans, our hopes, our dreams, and we bring them into submission to God, realizing that maybe God might look at our plans and say, that's not where I want you to go at all right now. That's a difficult place to be. See, the thing about carrying a cross is it's a one-way destination. It's a one-way journey. When someone would carry his cross to crucifixion, he wasn't coming back from that. It wasn't like, I'm going to go deposit this cross and then I'll be home 5 o'clock for dinner, honey, okay? We'll meet at home, or you want to go out to eat tonight? That's not what carrying the cross was. When you carried your cross, you were not coming back from that. You were going to be crucified. Jesus is getting at that kind of commitment. Are you willing to go there in following me? In another passage in the Bible, we read that once we become united with Christ in baptism, we become crucified with Christ. I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So the life I live in this body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself up for me. That's in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. We carry our cross when we follow Jesus. So here are two illustrations that Jesus gives to this point, and here's where the stories come in. There are two different illustrations, two short stories that Jesus tells to make this point about commitment. The first one is about a man who begins to build a tower. And so Jesus says, if one of you wants to build a tower, wouldn't you sit down and estimate the cost? But basically what Jesus is saying here is, who wouldn't do this? We all know that's common sense. You don't start building something until you know how much it costs, how much you have, what you may need to finish the project. All of those go in to figuring out if you can do this. Jesus says if you don't do this and all you have the money for is to lay the foundation, which is very important, but that's all you can do, people are going to ridicule you and say, man, they weren't prepared at all. They didn't really think this through, did they? Have you ever heard someone say that to you? Maybe as a teenager, you didn't really think that through, did you? That's what happens when we don't consider the cost here. Now, there's a historical event that happened a few years before Jesus shares this. It happened 5 miles north of Rome. There was an amphitheater built in a place, a small town north of Rome, and unfortunately, it was built quickly, and they cut corners in order to cut the cost. And what ended up happening was one of the worst disasters in all of history. When the crowd filled the amphitheater, and Roman historians debate, was it 20,000 or 50,000 people? it couldn't support, and it collapsed. So somewhere between 20 and 50,000 people died because somebody built something which they did not spend the time really looking into. What do we need to do this right? What is the cost involved? Instead, they weren't willing to pay that cost, and so they cut corners. You see, the same thing happens in our lives. When we cut corners in our faith with Jesus, our house of faith collapses in on us. And we wonder, what just happened here? Because we were never fully committed in the first place. We were cutting corners thinking that we could build our lives on the solid rock that Jesus talks about, but we didn't really count the costs and take the time to do what needed to be done. Building is a choice. Building this tower was a choice that this person made in the story that Jesus tells. And the question is, can I afford to follow Jesus? Can I afford to follow Jesus? Do we have enough to finish the job? The second story that Jesus tells involves going to war. Now, this is a little different than the first story because in this story, a king is going to war against another king. And he's going to consider if he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one who's coming against him with 20,000. So the picture is a king is on the march against another king. And the king who's about to be attacked, he needs to figure out, how many men do I have? And can the men that I have do the job here? Can we defend ourselves? I think this may be a little nod to something that happens within a few years of this writing, and that is when Herod Antipas, in about 36, the year 36, he goes to war against a Nabatean king. And you know what started that war? Well, Herod was married to this king's daughter. He divorced her to marry the wife of his brother Herodias. You remember who called him out for doing that? John the Baptist. Well, he ended up going to war against this Nabatean king who was also a vassal of Rome, and he ended up losing. He didn't count the cost. So what do we do in this particular case? The war is not this one king's choice. The war is coming to him. And so he has to count the cost. Can I defend my people? And if I cannot defend my people, then I'm going to take steps to avoid war. I'm going to send a delegation, and we're going to try to work this out. So we're building a tower. Building is a choice. We could say, can I afford to follow Jesus? Having someone come to war against you is not a choice. And the question is, well, can I afford not to follow Jesus? In both examples, the question becomes, can I finish this? Do I have enough? So the bottom line in these stories that Jesus tells is simply this. Look at verse 33, chapter 14, verse 33. Jesus says, in the same way. He doesn't want us to miss the point here. Those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. He comes right back to the priority theme. This is really about total commitment, complete surrender, giving up everything to be His disciple. And what the world counts it as everything, in essence, what do we really give up to follow Jesus when Jesus provides us everything that we ultimately need? What does it look like in your life to give up everything to follow Jesus, to be totally committed? I want to caution you, avoid the comparison trap here. It's easy to look at other people and to base my commitment on what someone else is doing. Well, I've been to church every Sunday this month and they've only been twice. Or I give and I've heard that so-and-so does not give. I've volunteered in this ministry. I was up here at the building every time we had an event going on. We begin to compare ourselves to others, and that's not what Jesus is wanting us to do. The question is for you and you alone, for each one of us. What does it look like in my life to be fully committed to Jesus? That's the question that we answer. Following Jesus is demanding, but it's not burdensome. Jesus has said elsewhere that if we will trust Him and follow Him, we will find out that what looks burdensome is really freeing. In fact, He says, I'll take the weight off your shoulders. Trust me in this. So Jesus tells two stories about total commitment. And here's the great thing about it. When we feel like we can't give that total commitment, when we feel like we're empty, God fills our cup. And Jesus gives us the grace we need to continue to follow Him.